Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the second in our two-part series, The Curse of the Quiet Ending, pieces that have the unmitigated gall to end with a whimper rather than a bang. Now, we've already talked about concertos, which was, in some respects, the more remarkable case, because you're dealing with, egomaniacal soloists who want to get as much applause as possible from the audience, and a quiet ending is guaranteed to make them somehow slightly less important than they probably think they ought to be. But now we're talking about 12 symphonies. And this poses an entirely different problem simply because the symphony is supposed to be the highest, most grandiose, most profound form of symphonic music. And therefore, a rousing ending, a big ending, is almost de rigueur. And when something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to happen, people scratch their heads and go, oh, what's wrong? And things don't become as popular as they ought to be. And so this list is just as significant as the concertos, but the issues are a little bit different, just a little bit different. And I must say, I have left out of this list two of the most absolutely successful examples of quiet endings because there's nothing to discuss. They're just perfect. Those are Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6, the Pathétique, and Mahler's Ninth. Because, you just, what is there to say? Those are the only possible endings to those works, and the emotional sequence is so inevitable in its logic and ideal in its expression that nobody seems to complain about the fact that they end quietly. They're still big second-half works that provide the climax of a concert, and no one's ever had anything to say about it, which I think is kind of fascinating. But those are really the two major examples of this. Everything else could be questioned in some way, or at least has some sort of angle or slant that I think is worth discussing. So let's get started, shall we? First, Brahms' Third Symphony. Well, there's a reason why this is the least popular of the Brahms symphonies. It shouldn't be. It's incredibly tuneful. It is beautifully written. It is the shortest of all four of them. I mean, there's nothing not to love. The finale is incredibly exciting, but then, just as it's going like gangbusters, it settles down into a long autumnal coda. And it's the autumnaciousness that I think actually kind of puzzles some people. But it also raises the question, because it's kind of short, where on a program do you put it? I mean, is it at the beginning? Is it at the end? Mahler, when he was a conductor, always used to put the longest and most complicated piece at the beginning of a program. Just the opposite of what people do now, because his argument was he wanted the audience to hear it when they were fresh. And if there was something challenging about it, this way they would be more receptive and they wouldn't be bored. That was a very, very smart observation. And indeed, I think one of the best performances of the Brahms Third I've ever seen in my life happened by placing it all by itself on the beginning of a program. That was with Raphael Frubeck de Burgos with the National Symphony in Washington. The first half was Brahms' Third. The second half, get this, was the Poulenc Double Piano Concerto and La Mer. It turned out, you would think, oh my God, but it turned out to be an absolutely fabulous program. It just worked. It worked really well because you had the Brahms all by itself, and they turned in an explosive, insanely exciting performance, which made the first half as rousing and exciting and refreshing as possible, and it just whetted the appetite for the second half, which was a joy from beginning to end. It was a fantastic concert. It really was, and it does show the truth of Mahler's dictum that a fresh audience is sometimes better for the more difficult, or at all events, less conventional work. And there's nothing more to be said for it except that Brahms' Third is my favorite of the Brahms symphonies, and And there's no reason why it shouldn't be more popular than it is. It turns out, very interestingly, that in Brahms' own lifetime, the third was his most popular symphony, at least for a while, probably because it was the shortest, not because it ended quietly, and also because concerts in those days did not insist on the primacy of the symphony being a major event. In those days, the major event in a concert would be the famous operatic soloist who sang a bunch of arias, or the famous concerto soloist who did a bunch of short pieces. Concerts were so much more varied, and so this tended to place the symphony in a rather different context, one which diminished rather than enhanced its importance. And again, I think that was probably a good thing. I mean, that symphony was written for the concert circumstances of its day, and those circumstances really had a lot more variety than we're used to now, and a lot more convention, and a lot more new music on top of all of it. So there you go. Brahms' Third is the first symphony that ends quietly. The piece, of course, is perfect as it stands, but that doesn't prevent it from being less popular than the other three. Next, Vaughan Williams, Symphony No. 2, a London symphony. Now, all of Vaughan Williams' symphonies, except for numbers 4 and 8, end quietly. I mean, the ninth kind of ends with a bang and then fades off, but they basically end quietly. And so does the London Symphony, with an absolutely beautiful, misty, fabulous epilogue that returns to the tone and mood and music of the symphony's very opening, which is something that we will see again quite shortly. It ought to be as popular as any Tchaikovsky symphony or anything by anybody else. This symphony has everything. It has gorgeous orchestration. It has fabulous tunes. It has enormous, eruptive, romantic climaxes. It's just fantastic. And it even has Big Ben chiming at the beginning and at the end. You know, the Westminster chimes. Do, 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 do. Yeah, it's got everything. But it ends quietly. And it's a big, long, quiet epilogue, actually. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's moody and misty and atmospheric. It's a London fog rolling down the River Thames. Oh, it's just wonderful. But I have a feeling that because of that ending, and because it's a big work, you know, it's a big 45, 50-minute long work, it has to go in the second half. It has to be the second part of the concert. And so people aren't going to want it to end quietly. When it's over, it's really over. The concert is really over. Maybe it gets played more often in the UK. I'm sure it does, of course. But, you know, when I performed it with my own little community orchestra, boy, we had a good time. What a great piece it was. And it's very popular. Everybody loves it. But it ends quietly. And that was an issue. It still is. Next. Here's a very, very interesting case. Prokofiev, Symphony No. 7. Now, the Prokofiev 7th has two endings, a soft ending and a loud ending. The soft ending was deemed to be far too childlike and unsatisfactory. It's just a repeated motive in the glockenspiel and xylophone and pizzicato violins going bum bum ba dum bum bum ba bum 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 ba bum, like that. And, you know, the music tries to derail it, but it just keeps going on in its little childlike way until finally there's a little tiny pizzicato and blink, it's gone. Well, apparently that caused some consternation, particularly in the Soviet Union, where huge triumphant endings were supposed to be absolutely the socialist realist necessity. And so Prokofiev wrote a coda. The piece ends the way it normally ends, and then it starts again with a chukka 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 chuk, and then it goes womp. And some people really hate that ending. It's obviously tacked on. I mean, you could, you know, there's no mistaking where the piece really ended. And it does do the necessary loud, get the applause thing. many conductors these days revert to the original ending. Rostropovich, most famously, they said, come on, who is he kidding? I actually like the coda, sort of as a coda. It works quite well, but it is unquestionably not the true ending of the symphony. And that is the symphony that really, really sort of asks the question, whither the quiet ending? You tell me. I tend to prefer the original ending. I don't have any problem with quiet endings. And by the way, it's especially true that quiet endings, I think, have become more acceptable. I really believe this since the advent of the recording. Because what happens in your home when you're listening at home, that's up to you. And it's never a problem when you're sitting there by yourself, just listening to something. It ends quietly. You change the record, It's very different than in a giant public forum like a concert hall, live. We have a much better ability, I think, because of recordings, to appreciate the beauty and significance and inevitability of quiet endings. And for that reason, in some respects, although everyone screams about how, a recording is incomparable, you can't compare them to live, and live is always better, and recordings aren't music, and blah, 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 blah. It's endless jabber, jabber, jabber. It's nonsense. Recordings are different. They have their own legitimacy. And in one respect, I think they have a superior legitimacy to the live event, and that is in projecting the correctness and inevitability of quiet endings. Think about that. Anyway, after Prokofiev 7, there's Sibelius 6. And this is, it's the only other Sibelius symphony, let's see, that ends quietly. You might argue the fourth does, although it ends, as one of you pointed out, if I do a series of symphonies that end mezzo forte, there's that one. Actually, the seventh kind of ends with a mezzo forte too, but it's still a pretty firm ending. The sixth evaporates back into the D minor of its opening, and it is an enigmatic work. It's just that simple. It's Sibelius's least popular symphony. For that reason, I suspect it's short, it's compact. None of its endings are really satisfying. The first movement, it keeps trying to end and then finally kind of gives up. And then the second movement sort of just stops rather abruptly. The scherzo has a real loud ending. But that loud ending, it's kind of funny. It's the shortest movement, and it has the biggest ending. And it's sort of out of proportion to like the rest of the symphony. It's like, why is it building up to this huge climax and big, loud thump of an ending? And then you get the finale. Now, the finale has a magnificent moment of culmination. And as I said in my discussion of concertos, if you have good enough culmination, you can justify a quiet ending because you've got the big climax before, and the quiet ending is the inevitable outcome of the culmination. And Sibelius certainly does that. I mean, the ending of this symphony is the ending. And thinking about it in retrospect, it may be that it's the only logical ending after all of the somewhat unsatisfying ones that happened before. There is an element of genius to what Sibelius is trying to do here, but it's still emotionally, the whole piece is somewhat enigmatic. I mean, I think it's gorgeous. I just love it. But the ending can be an issue. And it does, like the Brahms Third, it raises a problem of where do you put it in a concert. Whenever I've seen it performed, it's always a first half piece. Always. Nobody puts it as the major work on the second half because it's only about 25 minutes long, and and it's going to just peter away. That's a shame, though, actually. I mean, because it has it has the depth of a major work. And it does, like Mahler said, need the concentration of a fresh audience to really appreciate it as much as it should be. But it's a tough piece to program. Sibelius did not make one's job easy. He did not. So after that, Elgar, Symphony No. 2. We're up to number 5 here. Now, Elgar Symphony No. 2 is actually another one of those classic examples of what can go wrong with a quiet ending, because at the premiere, the piece was not very successful at all. Elgar said of the audience, they sat there like stuffed pigs and didn't applaud very much because they didn't understand what was going on. And that quiet ending is what threw them. I can guarantee it. I mean, the whole symphony is immeasurably greater than the first symphony. And I know, now just wait a minute. Some of you are going to say, well, I like the first better. So let me just say straight off, nobody cares what you like. I'm not talking about what you like. I'm not talking about what I like. I'm talking about which of the two is the greater work. The greater work, bigger, deeper, more profound, all of those things. I mean, you might like McDonald's better than a 5-star meal at Lutece, at your major Michelin-starred restaurant, or 5-course meal, whatever it is. But the fact is, one of those two items requires vastly more technique and sophistication and effort than the other. And that's all I'm saying. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things, it's a question of just making a comparison of what they are. Whether you like them is a totally separate issue. So the Second Symphony is the greater work, the bigger work, the more substantive work. And it was not popular. And I have a feeling it was because after all of that storm and drang and stress, and also a finale of extreme emotional ambiguity, unlike that of the First Symphony, which works its way up to this enormous triumphant ending, it's a problem. It's a problem. It just ends softly. It's very beautiful and very elegiac and not at all what people were expecting back in the day. Nowadays, of course, people are more accepting, but back then, they wanted another Elgar first, and they didn't get it. They got the second. Good for Elgar. Absolutely good for Elgar. Next, Roussel, Symphony No. 2. This is possibly the greatest French symphony ever by anybody. It's an extraordinary piece of writing. Everybody who has heard it agrees. I remember when Christoph Eschenbach recorded it for Ondine, and it's a very good performance. And he said something like, in an interview or somewhere, it's like, oh, it's a masterpiece. I couldn't believe it. It's like, well, duh. I just love it when artists find great pieces of music that they'd never paid attention to and try and give it their imprimatur, as though if they had, it wasn't a masterpiece until they discovered it, or because they discovered it, now it's a masterpiece when it wasn't previously. The unintentional egomania behind some of these comments is really, really amusing and sort of scary to look at. But Roussel's second is a deep and disturbing and troubled and very, very beautiful symphony. And the quiet ending is really, it could not go any other way. No way. It just couldn't. But having gotten there, the piece is as good as unknown. Nobody plays it. It really is. It's a very austere, very, it's confrontational. It really is. Musically, it's confrontational. It is not out to make friends. And it doesn't. And it hasn't. And it's a shame because it shoulda. It's fantastic. And after Roussel, we'll stay in France for a bit. Honegger, Symphony No. 3, the Liturgique. Obviously the greatest of the Honegger symphonies. Now, Honegger symphonies also all end quietly, except for No. 2, which is for strings only. All the others, I think, have fairly quiet endings, although some of them culminate, and boy, does this culminate. Oh, my God. It culminates in an apocalypse of annihilation. Oh, it's amazing. And then there's a coda of exhausted peace and tranquility with a little bit of bird song and the piccolo tweeting out in the front, the motto theme of the whole symphony, up top. Oh my goodness, it's just such a beautiful moving work. But boy, is that a tough one to program because it's only in 3 movements. It's only 25 to 30 minutes long. It is not a happy symphony by any stretch of the imagination. It has that huge dissonant climax. And then the end is tranquil and very, very beautiful. Extremely beautiful, diaphanous and luminous and all of those things. But no, it's definitely also not designed to be a crowd pleaser. It's designed to deliver a message, a disturbing message. And so there's a quiet ending, which, however perfectly realized, is in the context of an overall emotional journey, which may be difficult for some listeners to take. And this is another first half piece. Because if you do it on the second half and you have that exhausting and I mean, if you really play it the way it's supposed to be, and it really has the effect it's supposed to have, what are you going to put as a rousing encore? An excerpt from, the Nutcracker Suite, España, like Thomas Beecham used to do. He always used to put España after Sibelius's fourth. It really is, which worked perfectly well. It got people to leave happy, if that's what your intention is. But certainly Honegger's intention was not that everybody should leave happy. It's they should leave at least at a minimum thoughtful and at a maximum completely emotionally devastated. And so putting, España or Finlandia or something like that after the Honegger third would be, let's just say, contrary to the composer's intentions in the Honegger third. But you can do it any way you want. Maybe if it makes the concert work, it's better to hear it than not hear it. This is another symphony, by the way, that really has come into its own on recordings, because you can really appreciate and enjoy the beauty of that coda. I've told this story before, but I remember when I was at the radio station, WJHU, and I played this before the news. And the our newscaster was this really goth punk rock lady who, had piercings and tattoos and hair that was like 75 different colors. And I played that, and she was in tears by the time the news started. She just said to me afterwards, she said, that was unbelievable. That was so beautiful. Because she came in 5 minutes before the end to get ready for the news, and she's listening to what's on, and she was like, wow. Yeah, that's the point. And you can do the news after Honegger's third. Perhaps that would be the most appropriate, particularly if it's bad news, which it seems to be so often these days. So after Honegger's third, Bach's Symphony No. 3. Now, Bach also wrote, like Sibelius, he wrote 7 symphonies. 2 of them have loud endings, numbers 1 and number 5. All the rest have long, quiet, elegiac codas. Now, I am not claiming that the second is Bach's greatest symphony. I just like it the most, so I put it there. But, the third is supposed to be better. The sixth may be his greatest. I'm not here to argue those things. I'm just using number 2 as an exemplar, because I remember the first time I heard it, I was thinking, oh, this is great. Oh, my God, it's gorgeous. The tunes are fabulous. The orchestration's amazing. And the finale gets going like gangbusters. And then all of a sudden, oh, no, a quiet ending. No. The reason you like to have big endings in Bach's is only because his orchestration is so marvelous. And his handling of the orchestra is so bravura, and obviously so. It draws attention to itself. And then you have the obligatory quiet epilogue. That was Bach's thing, to have 3 movement symphonies with a quiet epilogue at the end. It was sort of his own take on symphonic form, and a perfectly legitimate one. But I do think his own style tends to create expectations that those endings don't necessarily fulfill. They do work once you understand his own style, his own take on symphonic form and what he was doing. But on initial acquaintance, I found it rather disturbing. Maybe you do too. I don't know. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It really is. Thank God, once again, for recordings that allow us to take in these symphonies that we'll never hear in concert, never in a billion years, and acclimate to them, get to know the composer's language. So we begin to get a sense of where it's going and how it's developing and what he's likely to do and what he needed to do, actually, out of emotional necessity in some of these other works. Very, very interesting question, how those quiet endings emerge and how we come to get used to them. Now, I know, of course, some of you probably heard it and said, oh, yes, it's the greatest quiet ending ever. I'm totally thrilled. But my reaction was somewhat different, and I suspect that all of those quiet endings have had something to do with why those symphonies don't get played as often as they might. I think that's a really significant issue. I forget, does the fourth end loudly too? I don't think it does. I don't know. I'd have to go back. I'd have to go back and check because I know some of them very well and some of them quite a bit less well. I have to be perfectly honest with you. I really do. They're all very good pieces, but there are only so many hours in a lifetime. And boy, I've, used up a lot of mine. So there you go. So that's Bach's. Next, Stravinsky, the Symphony in C. Why is the Symphony in C so much less popular than the Symphony in three movements, even though they always get recorded together? Well, The reason is because the Symphony in C simply ends softly with icy cold chords, Stravinskyan icy coldness, emotionally numb stasis, like so many of his pieces, actually, like Apollo and Orpheus and Oedipus Rex, and Stravinsky wrote endings that achieve this sort of, the word was stasis. Frozen time is the expression that some Stravinsky scholars use. And the Symphony in C ends that way. And it does it very unexpectedly because the Symphony in C is a very neoclassical work. It begins, da 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 da. It's just all C major. It really is. And the inner movements are really neoclassical, faux Baroque, classical, filigreed sort of things. And the finale begins with that really sort of annoying introduction for bassoons. I remember a friend of mine described it as if dogs could talk. That's what the music would sound like. I think she had a point. She really did. And the finale gets going. It's marvelous. And then it peters out and just dissolves into these static chords. It's an ending that's very Stravinskyan and very modern and very contrary, I think, to the expectations that the music arouses in us. That, of course, is part of the point. Part of the point of the music is that although it's the neoclassicism, it's okay, I'm going to imitate this style, but we're only going so far. And after a certain point, it's going to do its own thing. So once you get used to it, once you know it, once you understand it, you may well come to love it. But the first time that you hear it, oh my goodness, the first time I heard it, I was like, what? That was it? Holy mackerel, what's the matter? I was like waiting for something else to happen, but it doesn't. The end is the end. And whether it satisfies you or not, I think is a very personal thing. And after that, Shostakovich 8. Shostakovich 8 is by many, many, many people's opinion or estimation his greatest symphony, if not one of them. 8 and 10, 5, 8, and 10. Those are the biggies. Maybe 15. I think Babi Yar is up there, but it's a choral work, so it's a little different. But the eighth has one of those endings in exhaustion. It's the Shostakovich Infinity ending, a version of it. There's one version of the Infinity ending that has the tick-tock. The second cello concerto that I talked about in the previous video on quiet endings, that also ends the 15th Symphony, which also ends quietly, and the Scherzo of the Fourth Symphony. Fourth Symphony also ends quietly, but there are all of Shostakovich's quiet endings, or most of them, are these sort of infinity endings where the music stops. There's a long sustained chord or note somewhere, and underneath it there's an ostinato. In this case it's bum bum blum, bum bum blum, bum 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 bum. It just does that over and over again. It just tick-tocks over and over again until it fades out. And in this case, the infinity ending is the result of complete, total exhaustion. Shostakovich is paying lip service to the end to the need or the socialist realist demand that the work end happily. That is in C major, because it's a C minor symphony, and it does. It's a major key ending, but it's not a happy one. It's a soap bubble of fragility, And nobody was fooled in this case. It wasn't like the fifth, where the end is a big pounding triumphant thing, because that's what it's supposed to do, whether it wants to or not. In this case, that ending is the inevitable outcome of the violence and emotional devastation of everything that occurs previously. And so, I think it's a perfectly realized coda to the entire symphony. I really do. It's where it has to go. I could not imagine a happy ending to this symphony, a loud, triumphant ending to this symphony. That is so not where it is. It tries. But of course, the whole point about it is that the emotional point, as I've said before, is so perfectly evident. It's music trying to be happy. It tries to be jolly. It has tunes that are happy, but they're broken. It's an illusion. And at the end, we realize that, yes, it has been an illusion all along. It's very, very disturbing and very gripping and very right at the same time. So here we are now at number 11. And this is an interesting case, too. Tippett, Symphony No. 1. Now, Tippett's first symphony is, in his own estimation, not entirely successful. And one of the sort of less successful things is the ending, which is open-ended. It's not an ending at all. The finale is a triple fugue. It's a big, contrapuntal, buoyant thing. I love the triple fugue. It's exciting and springy and full of life and vitality. And it comes up to this big climax. And then the bass drum comes thumping in with da, da, boom. And then it keeps doing that. Da, da, boom. And then finally, boom. And then less. Boom. And then, boom. And that's it. It just fades out that way. It doesn't end. It just stops or gets stopped. And obviously, the composer's intention was totally deliberate. Is it totally satisfying? Well, I love the work. I don't think that ending is really very nice. I'm not sure what he would have done to end it. Maybe he just gave up. One of the problems with unsatisfying quiet endings is that they run the risk of suggesting that the composer really did not know how to stop it. He did just give up. This is sort of the locus classicus of something, an ending that does that. I have never heard this piece live. I don't ever expect to, quite frankly. It's also a tough piece in other ways. It's rhythmically tricky. It's harmonically, it's tonal, but it's quite tonal. It has tunes and everything, but nothing goes where you think it's supposed to. It is a very challenging kind of slap in your face work that, like the Stravinsky Symphony in C, actually presents itself in a cloak of acceptability and niceness, but that's just not where it goes. And so, in a way, the ending is appropriate to much of what has come before, but it leaves you with a very, very unfulfilled feeling, I think. And, sometimes that's the intention. That's what's supposed to happen. But it's not going to guarantee you lots of performances. That's for damn sure. However, my last and one of my absolute favorite quiet endings that isn't Tchaik 6 or Mahler 9 is Magnard's Fourth Symphony. We are finally, in the past few decades, coming to realize that Magnard's four symphonies, all of them, are some of the great works in the form by a French composer. And the fourth is a flat-out screaming masterpiece, extraordinary work, and it ends with a motto theme. That motto theme you hear at the beginning of the first movement, and it also ends the first movement. It is such a wonderful little motto theme. Part of the joy of it is how beautiful it is. It's ya da 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 da. Ya da 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 da, like that, sort of, And, well, that's the tune, and the first movement ends that way, but with open harmonies, not fulfilled harmonies. And the last movement, you finally get the full triad. So the thing ends with this major chord. It is the most fulfilling moment you'll ever hear in your life. And it comes after just an extraordinary coda. I mean, this transcendental, completely fulfilling culmination of everything that has gone before. And so as the music finally dies down into calm, that ending, that return of the motto, the end is the beginning. From the beginning of the whole symphony has a feeling of completion and satedness, satiety, whatever you call that word. It really just goes there. You leave with such a feeling of repletion and total rightness. Wow, what a great quiet ending that is. I mean, it is an absolute clinic in how to make a quiet ending absolutely inevitable and perfect. Absolutely perfect. I have to stop using the word absolutely. But it is. It really is. It's an extraordinary work. And if you still haven't heard Magnard's Fourth Symphony, just go listen to it. Please. And listen to that quiet ending. Listening to that motto theme. Ya da 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 da. Ba da 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 da. Oh God, it's wonderful. It'll get stuck in your head. It really will. And there aren't that many quiet endings that get stuck in your head that are real earworms, but that's one of them. So there you go, my friends. 12 symphonies that end quietly with, I think, some interesting corollaries, some interesting things to think about form, about the role of recordings, about where you are when you're listening and what mood you're in, what the composer's intentions are. All of those things, they raise wonderful questions. This is a wonderful pile of examples, along with the concertos too, to get you thinking critically about musical form and musical expression and the relationship between the two. So, take it from that perspective. And if you haven't heard these works, go listen to them and keep that in mind while you're listening and see if that doesn't unlock some of the, additional depth of expression that most of these pieces certainly reveal. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.